The underground market salt smuggling became a profession. Men and women called faux sauniers moved sacks at night, tied bags under carts, hid it in loaves of bread, lining of coats, hollowed shoes. Children were used as runners. Dogs were trained. To carry salt across rivers, punishment was severe, but so was hunger. And so the smugglers kept moving. They carved paths through woods, dug tunnels beneath border checkpoints. One smuggler in Angoulême ran salt in hollow violin cases. They called him le joueur muet, the silent player. He was never caught. The ledger that cried in the city of Bourges, a clerk named Mathieu kept records for the salt storehouse. He had soft hands, a crooked nose, and dreams of becoming a painter. But each day he wrote down the same thing. 1 sack, 2 sacks, half sack, overdue, overdue, paid with chickens. In his personal journal he wrote, "They come with coins too thin to hold." One man wept when I wrote his name in the book. I wish I had the heart to spill the ink instead. No one ever saw the journal. But when it was found decades later in a collapsed cabinet, the last page read, "This kingdom is salted with tears." The boy who licked the rock in a village near the border of Brittany, a boy named Émile, found a salt crystal. The size of a stone. He licked it, then hid it. His mother used it to cure meat for winter. A gabelou found out. The family was fined 10 livres, more than they earned in a month. The salt crystal was seized. Émile watched it taken away in a leather pouch. He grew up to be a guard at a Paris prison, and later a witness to something called the storming of the Bastille. When asked what started it all, he said, "They took our salt." The cart that broke one winter morning in 1788, a salt wagon tipped over near Châteauroux. The barrels split. White powder spilled into the mud. Children rushed forward with aprons and cups. Soldiers beat them back. One child, a girl, held out a tin spoon. She was struck with the butt of a musket. She did not cry. But later that night, someone lit fire to the wagon. The flames curled blue and white. The smoke smelled strange. And from that moment on, no wagon crossed that road again. Salt in this story isn't on your tongue. It's on your fingers, in the cracks of wooden crates, on the shoulders of men who've carried it for miles just to stay alive. Salt was once called white gold, but in France, it was also called a curse. Let's walk deeper now, into the courts, kitchens, border towns, and empty storehouses where the smallest mineral became the biggest offense. The border inspectors. There were salt lines across France, invisible on maps, but very real to those who crossed them. Between taxed and untaxed zones, soldiers waited. They searched wagons. They examined boots. In one town, a man was stopped for carrying too little salt. He was fined for failing to meet his legal minimum, the amount each citizen was forced to buy. He protested, showed his spoon, said he couldn't eat more than that. They called it evasion. He was sentenced to 5 days in the stocks, and rain fell every one of them. A royal request in the palace kitchens of Versailles, the Queen's steward sent a note. The sea salt from Brittany is preferred. It makes the oysters brighter. The request was granted, quietly, illegally. Royal exemption allowed it. But the chef, a man named Claude Ternier, hesitated. His father had been jailed for using unsanctioned salt to cure goat meat in Provence. Claude served the oysters, but he didn't eat any himself. The warehouse that emptied overnight in the town of Montauban, a royal salt warehouse, was found empty one morning. No sign of break-in, no tracks, no sacks, just dust, and a small chalk drawing on the inside wall, a crown, melting into a pile of white crystals. No one was arrested. The guards were questioned. They said only, "We slept light," heard nothing. But people in town began seasoning their food more freely, and suddenly the soup tasted like defiance. The salt of silence in a monastery in the Dordogne. Monks kept their own salt. They claimed it was for preservation, for cheese, for ceremony. But a tax agent found a hidden supply, 120 pounds stored in clay pots beneath the chapel floor. He filed a report. The monks offered no defense, but when summoned to court, they arrived barefoot, carrying a bowl of water. Inside, a single pinch of salt. They placed it before the judge and said, "This is what we're guilty of." The judge fined them, but the crowd outside cheered. A child's drawing. A boy named Julian, age 7, drew a picture of his family dinner. He showed it to his teacher. It depicted a table with bread, water, and a white shaker. The teacher asked, "Is that sugar?" The boy shook his head. "It's the salt we're not allowed to use." The drawing was pinned to the classroom wall. The next day it was gone, taken by a man in uniform. No one mentioned it again. The salt of the dead in some villages. Salt was placed on the tongues of the dead. An old tradition, preservation, purification. But under the gabelle it became a risk, using untaxed salt for burial. Illegal. And so families began hiding salt in lace, in socks, in pouches stitched into coffin linings. One priest in Lyon refused to report it. He said, "Let them bury with taste. The crown already starved them in life." He was removed from his post, but the tradition continued. A Paris speech in 1789, a deputy from the Third Estate stood in the National Assembly. He held up a single salt crystal, not large, not clean, just white, hard, familiar. He said, "This is not seasoning. This is submission, and it should never cost more than bread." Applause followed. The king said nothing. But somewhere outside, someone carved the words into the side of a well. They're still faintly visible, if the light hits right. Through the salt paths of France, where boots scraped against stone, barrels leaked in silence, and the smallest mineral carved cracks in something once believed unbreakable. This isn't a dramatic collapse, just the long, slow erosion of trust, crystal by crystal. The woman with the blue apron in Orléans. A woman named Madeleine kept a salt pouch tied under her apron, blue cloth drawstring. Every week, she'd walk 5 miles to the border between salt tax regions. She never spoke on the road, never smiled, but the locals watched her pass and always nodded. One day, she didn't return. No one knew where she'd gone. A week later, her pouch appeared. At the village well, tied around the handle, empty, no note, but someone carved into the stone. The salt was never hers to carry. The boy who refused in a classroom near Rouen, a tax agent, gave a demonstration. He showed the children how to measure royal salt, how to fold the parchment, how to stamp the receipt. A boy named Henri stood and said, "But my father cures meat without paper." The room went silent. The agent asked his name. Henri wouldn't answer. He was taken from the room. His classmates were told not to ask questions, but someone drew a salt pouch in the dust on the floor that afternoon. It stayed there all a week. The warehouse that collapsed. One rainy night in Limoges, the roof of a salt depot caved in, heavy barrels. Poor beams. No one was inside. But by morning, the townspeople had cleared away the rubble. The salt? Gone. No one spoke of it. Not to the guards, not to the clerks, not even to each other. But bread was suddenly better that week, and the word glissement, slippage, was whispered with a smile. The clerk who forgot to record Etienne was a royal record keeper. He wore spectacles, wrote carefully. But one spring, he stopped entering salt violations. He logged grain. He logged timber. He even logged shoes, but not salt. His supervisor noticed, asked why. Etienne said, "I don't think I believe in it anymore." The next day, his desk was empty. His last note left behind: salt should never fear daylight. The fish without seasoning in Marseille. A vendor known for her fried fish stopped using salt. The dish was worse. She lost customers, but when asked why, she simply said, "If they take my seasoning, I'll serve them the truth." Later, someone tried to pay her with royal salt. She refused, gave the man a free fish, said, "The next taste is on me, let it be honest." The riot at the way station in July of 1789, at a roadside station outside Tours, a traveller was stopped. His bag held sea salt, clean white, free. He claimed it was for his goats. The guards seized it. An argument followed, then shouting, then bricks. Within an hour, the way station was on fire. By evening, 3 more along the road had closed. The next day, the word "sel libre," free salt, appeared on walls carved in doors, written in soap on windows. The phrase spread faster than fire. Versailles notices. In the palace, ministers gathered reports. Small ones, petty ones, missing barrels, refused sales, quiet stores. 1. Advisor to the king remarked, "It's just salt," another replied. "Then why does it burn so many tongues?" The king asked for clarification. He was told not to worry. He did not bring it up again. But months later, when the gates were stormed, the kitchens found salt pouches scattered across the floor. None were royal. The final ledger in a dusty archive. There is a single book, stamped with a crown, marked Gabelle, 1789. The last page has only one line, not a fine, not a name, just this: "The salt is no longer ours." No author listed, no hand signed, but someone, somewhere, had written it, and closed the book forever. What time is it where you are right now? Are you lying in bed, letting the weight of the day slowly melt from your shoulders? Maybe your room is dim, or maybe there's nothing but the flicker of a fireplace on a screen. Either way, you're here. And it's quiet now, that's all that matters. So let's go back to a time before trains, before the camera, before napkins were paper. The year is 1787. France is not yet in full revolution, but something, many things, are quietly simmering under the surface. And somewhere in the mirrored halls of Versailles, an ordinary dinner is being prepared. Candles lit, fireplaces roaring, servants moving like shadows down corridors of gold leaf and marble. This is a story about a meal, not one of legends or battles, not a coronation, not a final supper, just a dinner, one that should have been forgotten. But wasn't, because sometimes it's not the big things in history that bring change. It's the quiet ones, like a silver spoon resting too heavily on an empty plate. The table imagined the Hall of Mirrors, not in ceremony, but in preparation. The air thick with the scent of stewed meats, almond tarts, and sweat behind powdered wigs. The dining hall had its own rules, and we dozens of them. A hierarchy of etiquette so layered, it could take years to master. Everyone was watching everyone else. Fork in the wrong hand? That could mean scandal, eating too quickly, a mark of a commoner. For King Louis XVI, dinner was both performance and pressure. At court, meals weren't private affairs. They were rituals, observed, critiqued, timed. His fork, for instance, must be turned downward. Bread must never be bitten, only broken. Meat must never be salted by hand, instead with special tongs held by a servant, whose only job was to carry salt. Even the plates, rimmed in gold and porcelain, weren't just for eating. They were messages, symbols of wealth, of permanence. But that evening something had changed. The meat was late. The lamb had gone cold by the time it reached the royal table. Not drastically, but enough. Enough for the king to frown. The kitchen, buried deep beneath the palace, had suffered a fire in one of its side ovens. No one was harmed, but the delay meant that one entire course, a roast en croûte stuffed with hazelnuts and dried goose, was off the table. Instead, a substitute dish was prepared in haste, chicken poached in watered-down wine. A servant dropped a platter. Another burned his hand, and while the courtiers smiled and sipped their spiced wines, small murmurs passed like invisible hands across the long table. The dinner was not quite right. Of course, no one outside the palace cared about cold lamb. But the event was not just a dinner. It was a signal, and those who served it understood that better than anyone. Below the marble floors, the stone hallways beneath the glitter of Versailles, hundreds of staff worked in silence. Scullions scrubbed pots, porters carried trays. Up narrow staircases, kitchen boys, often no older than 9 or 10, were responsible for fetching water from fountains, trimming root vegetables, and chasing rats from the storerooms. Versailles required over 300 pounds of bread daily. Around 30 cows were delivered each week. Barrels of wine, eels in baskets, apples wrapped in cloth, all had to be accounted for. The head steward of the kitchens, François Michel Delagarde, kept a thick ledger, and in that ledger he wrote, "A single note the night of the disrupted dinner. Fowl returned to pantry. Third course incomplete. Noted complaint from maitre d'hotel." It was a quiet notation, one of thousands. But years later, that ledger would be one of the few surviving. Documents that captured the moment things started to feel off, not wrong, not dangerous, just off. The guests who noticed among the diners that evening was the Comte d'Artois, younger brother to the king, a man who was far more interested in horses and fencing than food politics. He whispered to a duchess between bites of overcooked pigeon, gesturing toward the wine as if to joke. But the duchess didn't laugh. Her estate in Brittany had been overrun by bread riots only weeks before. She'd lost 2 barns to fire, and her steward had been beaten by his own workers. Across the table, a bishop dabbed his lips with a linen cloth and quietly remarked that the vintage wine had been watered. This was not meant to be heard, but it was by a merchant's son, newly ennobled. He would remember it years later as he stood outside the Bastille. The nobility at Versailles believed themselves insulated, and they were, mostly, but their dinner talk was being echoed elsewhere, and not by accident. A man with a quille Jacques Hébert, a pamphleteer and minor scribe, had taken to bribing footmen for rumors. That very evening, one servant, who worked in the lower cellar, slipped Hébert a note scribbled in charcoal on a torn napkin. The king's bird was cold tonight. The queen's wine was cut. To you and me that sounds absurdly meaningless, but to Hébert it was gold. He published it in his underground pamphlet the next morning. A snide, anonymous remark printed in blocky ink. If the king cannot keep his roast hot, how shall he keep his throne warm? It was satire. Slight, almost childish, but it spread. And every week the stories grew. The king's indigestion became national failure. The queen's refusal of dessert became royal disdain for the poor. And that night's dinner, it became legend. Meanwhile, in the city, that same night, October 5th, 1787, Paris was tense. Flour prices had risen yet again. A £3 loaf of bread cost nearly a day's wages. And while the king was fumbling with silver cutlery, the baker's quarter in Faubourg Saint-Antoine had seen its third protest in 5 days. One baker, Jean-Claude Vigneault, had locked his doors early. Not because he was sold out, but because he feared for his safety. His windows had been broken the week before. A group of children threw stones when he refused to give out credit. In a journal he kept hidden beneath the floorboards, he wrote, "There is talk of the Queen again. Her diamonds, her cream, her palace of gold while we beg for crust." He had never been to Versailles, but the idea of it, a meal in candlelight while children starved, was fuel, a palace of echoes, back at Versailles as the dinner came to. A close, the king retired to his study. He reportedly belched twice and drank a glass of aniseed liqueur. The queen did not attend the supper that night. She remained in her chambers, citing a touch of headache. Some whispered she had refused to eat altogether. The truth is, and we don't know if the queen ever knew what was served that evening. We don't know if the king noticed the wine was cut, or if the bishop's comment ever reached the royal ear. But we do know that in the days that followed, that quiet meal became something else, a story, then a pamphlet, then a metaphor, and eventually a reason for those with nothing to say. Even the king cannot dine like a king. A queen who didn't eat, Marie Antoinette, did not attend the meal that evening. That much is recorded. But why? Some say she had a headache. Others whispered it was vanity, that she refused to appear in her gown after discovering it had not yet arrived from Paris. The more suspicious believed it was deliberate, a form of silent protest against her husband's recent financial concessions to the Estates General. But none of these explanations are confirmed. What we do know is that the Queen dined privately that night, reportedly eating only bread, cheese, and a syrupy cordial made from preserved cherries. A servant named Eloise, who had worked in the Queen's dressing chamber for years, later, wrote, "She nibbled like a bird and said nothing. She looked out the window and tapped her spoon against her cup until the porcelain cracked. The spoon was never replaced." The gossip chain Versailles was not built for privacy. Its design, grand, echoing, full of mirrored corners and servants behind every panel, made it nearly impossible for a secret to survive more than an hour. The next morning, as sun crept across the checkerboard floors of the Hall of Mirrors, 3 footmen whispered in the servants' passage about the Queen's absence. A chambermaid, brushing crumbs from velvet cushions, overheard and passed the tale to the laundry mistress, who folded it into the linens and carried it back to town. By evening, the rumor had changed. The Queen had refused to eat because she found the food too poor for her taste. It wasn't true, but in a city where people ate boiled weeds and fought over onion peels, it didn't matter. Parisian paper and Inca, week later, in the dingy back room of a small print shop near Roucault. Jew Temple, a new pamphlet was set to type. It was titled, "The Queen Feasts on Jewels." Its author was anonymous. Its claims were wild. It described a fictional meal, a roasted peacock stuffed with pearls, honeyed figs in gold sauce, and wines imported from Persia. Of course, none of it was real, but that wasn't the point. The pamphlet was printed on rough, pulp in blotchy ink, and passed through dozens of hands within the first day. You could buy it for a copper coin, or steal it from a fence, or find it in the gutter. People didn't read it for truth. They read it to feel something, to feel angry, to feel included. And while Versailles dined in ritual and regulation, Paris consumed stories like these, raw, unfiltered, and hard to swallow. A distant echo in the treasury. At the same time, across the city in a marble office near the Seine, Charles-Alexandre de Calonne, the Controller General of Finances, was trying to cover a growing hole in the royal budget. The treasury was bleeding, not because of the dinner, but because dinners like it were endless. Versailles employed nearly 10,000 people. Its kitchens consumed 8% of the royal budget. Wine alone accounted for nearly 1 million livres per year. And now, grain prices were rising. Tax revenues were falling. The army needed boots, the roads needed repair, and the king had recently paid off the debts of several bankrupt nobles, all while refusing to tax the first and second estates. Calonne scribbled calculations late into the night, and beside a note on military wages and canal repairs, he wrote, "Reduce ceremonial budgets." Begin with kitchens. It was small, barely a sentence, but it was the start of something. The butcher's opinion back in Versailles, just outside the palace gates, a man named Luc Renard wiped blood from his apron and stacked his knives. He was the royal butcher, though royal only in title. He had never spoken to a king. He had never been inside the dining hall. His job was simply to prepare the meat ordered from Paris: beef, pork, lamb, sometimes veal. For weeks his orders had grown smaller, less veal, fewer bones for soup. And now the kitchen had returned a whole haunch of beef, claiming it was overly gamey. Luc muttered curses as he carried the meat home. He fed it to his dog. His wife, Jean, stood beside the fire and said, "They turn down meat and we can't afford bread. One day they'll eat their own crowns." She didn't mean it. Not really. But when her niece in Paris heard the remark and repeated it in the bakery where she worked, it became legend. In the Assembly of Nobles a few weeks later, the Assembly of Notables convened to discuss tax reform. It was a desperate attempt by the king's ministers to impose a land tax on the privileged classes, clergy, aristocracy, and nobility. The meeting took place in a long hall decorated with faded tapestries and smelled faintly of dust and cologne. The nobles wore powdered wigs and long coats. They debated in slow voices. One count claimed taxing land was insulting to the nobility's honor. Another argued that the people must learn thrift before the court practices it. And then, unexpectedly, a minor baron, Jules de I, Clermont, stood up and said, "Gentlemen, the people believe the queen eats from plates of rubies. They believe the king dines on the bones of their children. They do not believe in our honor anymore." Silence followed, and for a moment, even the oldest count looked uncertain. The baker's dreamer Faubourg Saint-Honoré, the baker Jean-Claude, Vigneault, whose windows had been shattered weeks before, had a strange dream. He dreamt of a table that stretched across all of France. A single unbroken table where every noble, every peasant, every merchant and soldier sat side by side. There was one loaf of bread on the table, just one, and as the king reached for it, the table split in two. He wrote the dream down, not in his journal, but on a small sheet of brown paper, which he later used to wrap a stale tart. The woman who received the tart read the words and pinned them to her wall. Years later, they were found in the rubble of a burned shop, mistaken for poetry. But they were just a dream, one that many people were beginning to share. The return of the meal. Month after the cold dinner at Versailles, a similar meal was held. Same number of guests, same wine, same golden plates. But this time, the roast was perfect. The queen attended, wearing diamonds shaped like lilies. And yet the mood was different. The laughter was thinner. The toasts were shorter. A strange quietness had settled, even as the harpist played. The king made a passing joke about the last meal. Something about roast chicken and spoiled sauce. No one laughed, because now the meal wasn't just food, it was memory. It was myth, and outside the gates people were hungrier than ever. A hollow room back in the Queen's chamber, long after the guests had left, Marie Antoinette is said to have stood at her balcony, watching the torches in the distance. A courier had brought news of a protest in Lyon, another in Toulouse. A mill burned down. A magistrate stoned in the street. She sipped her cordial, touched the cracked spoon, and said very quietly, to no one in particular, "What do they want from me?" The chambermaid Eloise, hidden in the shadows, said nothing. She folded the Queen's shawl, picked up the empty plate, and closed the door. The cookbook of a revolution, it may surprise you to learn that during the final years of the Ancien Régime, there were entire books written just about court cuisine. One such volume, La Table Royale, catalogued every dish served to the king between 1784 and 1789. It included instructions for pheasant in chestnut glaze, hare pie in saffron crust, and a peculiar favorite of the Queen, sugar-dusted truffles soaked in plum wine. The book was meant to be celebratory, a tribute to excess. But after the revolution began, copies of La Table Royale were burned in public squares. Others were kept, but not for praise. Revolutionaries studied it, not for recipes, but for evidence. Evidence that the court had gorged, while France starved. It became unintentionally one of the earliest pieces of culinary propaganda, a book of food turned into fuel, the waiter who vanished. A few months after the infamous dinner, one of the footmen who had served that night vanished. His name was Michael, no last name recorded, only that he was young, quiet, and fast on his feet. He had served the third course. He had poured the Queen's wine, the very glass she reportedly refused. And then in early 1788 he was gone. Some say he fled to Paris, changed his name, and joined a revolutionary printing press. Others believe he was dismissed quietly, a scapegoat for the rumors that followed. There is no official record of his fate, only a small note in the Versailles personnel log: Michel, absent, presumed dismissed, no inquiry requested. Like many servants of his time, he slipped between the cracks of history, seen only in the way he moved through the room, invisible but essential. The banquet that sparked a riot in October of 1789. Just 2 years after that cold dinner, the royal bodyguard held a ceremonial banquet in Versailles. It was supposed to boost morale. Nothing extravagant, just a meal of roast meats, bread, and claret wine. But to the people outside the palace, it was a final insult. Word spread that during the banquet, guards had trampled the revolutionary tricolour cockades, red, white, and blue rosettes worn to show support for the people. Whether or not it truly happened didn't matter. The next morning, thousands of women, fishwives, washerwomen, and market sellers marched from Paris to Versailles, not with pitchforks, with rolling pins, with kitchen knives. With aprons tied tight and children in tow, they chanted not about war or laws or borders. They chanted, "Bread, bread, give us bread." And behind that chant was everything, every rumor, every pamphlet, every cold plate. The Queen's final meal at Versailles on the evening of October 5th. As the marchers gathered outside the palace gates, Marie Antoinette sat down for what would be her last dinner at Versailles. No records remain of what she ate. Some say she refused food altogether. Others claim she was served boiled fowl and sweet wine, a comfort dish she had loved as a girl in Austria. The next day the palace was stormed. The Queen fled to the King's chambers barefoot. The King agreed to leave Versailles and travel to Paris, and just like that, The palace was no longer a home. It was a shell, a stage with no actors left. And the kitchens, once filled with 100 voices and sizzling pots, went quiet. The empty table Versailles was never looted in the way other royal buildings were. It was too symbolic, too sacred, too much. But its dining halls were stripped. Silver cutlery was sent to the mint, porcelain dishes broken or auctioned off. Golden plates melted into coins. One room remained untouched for months, the private dining salon of the Queen, a soft blue chamber with curved windows and a view of the rose gardens. When officials entered it in 1791, they found a table still, set for two crystal glasses, one with a faint ring of dried wine, one fork, a cloth napkin folded into the shape of a swan, and a menu card dated September 30th. The meal had never been served. The peasant who saw the palace. Among the women who marched on Versailles was a widow named Marguerite Roux. She had lost 2 children to starvation. She baked bread from sawdust and boiled cabbage 3 times to stretch its flavor. She had never seen a palace before, and when she stepped into the outer courtyard, she looked up at the windows and whispered, "The cook who survived it." Old Delegard, the head steward who had noted the cold chicken in his ledger, survived the revolution. He retired quietly to the countryside. He never spoke of Versailles, but in a letter to a friend, written in 1795, he said, "I fed kings and they fell. I stirred sauces while the world stirred itself. And in the end I find it is better to eat simply, quietly, with no one watching." His handwriting was small, neat, and the letter smelled faintly of time. A story that was never about food. It's easy to think of history in large shapes, battles, treaties, kings and crowns. But sometimes it begins with something smaller. Plate served too cold, a glass left half empty, a rumor whispered over a crust of bread. The French Revolution did not start because of dinner. Of course not. But the dinner, that cold, imperfect, human dinner, is where we can begin to feel it, because the world doesn't always change with swords. Sometimes it changes with spoons. The price on the chalkboard in a bakery on the Rue Saint-Martin in Paris, a man named Émile Beauregard scraped a piece of chalk against the wooden board above his shop door. He was adjusting the price of bread again, 2 sous more than yesterday. He hated doing it, but the flour had cost more at market that morning, and he couldn't afford another loss. Émile had once been proud of his work. He kneaded dough by hand, let it rise slow and warm under cloth. His loaves were thick, with a crust that cracked like old earth, but lately the joy was gone. Now each day began with the same thing, coins on the counter, questions he couldn't answer. Why is it more today? How can I feed 6 with this? Please, do you take credit? And each day ended the same way too, with Émile turning the key in the door, counting what little was left, and staring at a near-empty sack of flour. The flour road, most people don't think about where flour comes from. It just appears, in a bin, in a bag, on a shelf. But in 18th century France, flour had a journey, a long one. It began in the countryside, the Beauce plains, the wheat fields of Picardy, or the gently rolling valleys of the Loire. Farmers harvested the grain by hand, threshing it with flails, sifting it through linen, drying it in the sun. Then came the millers. With stone wheels turned by water or wind, they ground the wheat into flour. Some cheated, adding chalk to bulk the powder. Others scraped the barrels, mixing weevils and dust into the mix. Then came the porters, the wagons, the taxis at every bridge and town. And finally the sacks arrived in Paris. But Paris was a hungry mouth. It needed over 600,000 pounds of bread per day. And so, any delay, a storm, a broken cartwheel, A tax dispute sent ripples through the system. Prices soared. And bakeries became battlegrounds. A riot in Lyon in the spring of 1788. The City of Lyons suffered a particularly bad delivery month. The Rhone had flooded. Roads were washed out. Flour shipments slowed to a crawl. On April 19th, a baker in the Croix-Rousse district announced that he had no bread to sell. A crowd gathered by dawn. They were not revolutionaries, just people, women with babies on their hips, old men with walking sticks, a boy with soot on his face. The baker stood behind his counter and wept. When the crowd pushed inside, they didn't steal. They sat. That's what the police report said. Later, they entered and they sat. On the flour bins, on the counter, on the floor. And when guards arrived, they were too embarrassed to act. How do you arrest hunger? The hidden laws of grain France had something called the police des grains, grain police. Their job was to regulate the grain market, ensure fair weights, stop hoarding, and prevent speculation. But over time, the system had rotted. Merchants bought up grain cheap in the provinces and sold it high in the cities. Nobles used royal exemptions to bypass taxes, and some bakers, fearing spoilage or theft, kept flour hidden in false walls or buried beneath floorboards. An inspector named Toussaint Boissel found 87 hidden sacks in a wine cellar in Dijon. He filed a report. It was ignored. He filed another. This time he was transferred, and so flour became political. Whispers said the king controlled it. Others blamed the queen. Others said the church hoarded grain to sell during Lent. None of it was entirely true, but the truth didn't matter as much as the feeling that someone somewhere was full while everyone else was empty. A loaf and a letter. In the summer of 1788, a woman named Hélène Moreau wrote a letter to her sister. She lived in a small village outside Tours and baked bread in a stone oven she'd inherited from her mother. She wrote, "I sold my last loaf to a man with soft hands and a gold ring. He paid too much. I didn't want to take it, but I needed the salt. My neighbor saw. She hasn't spoken to me since. I feel like I've committed a crime with flour." That letter, never meant for public eyes, was found years later in a trunk in a convent. The convent had no oven. The nuns bought stale bread and soaked it in broth. The bakers of Paris begin to break by 1789. The bakers' quarter in Paris was fraying. Ovens went cold. Customers came angry. Some bakers put up boards to protect their windows. Others slept inside their shops, afraid of being robbed or worse. A few gave up entirely. They handed out what they had left and closed their doors for good. And then came the notices, small slips of parchment, tacked to posts and corners. Let it be known, he who hoards flour hoards the blood of France. The handwriting was always different, but the message was the same. The voice of the wheat fields while cities rioted, the countryside grumbled. Farmers, tired of watching their grain disappear down roads they didn't control, began keeping some. Back, a practice called retenue, a quiet form of resistance. They claimed it was for next season's seed, for family, for barter. But slowly barns began to fill, and the police des grains, underfunded and unpopular, stopped inspecting. They didn't want trouble, so the farmers kept their grain. The merchants raised their prices, the bakers raised theirs, and the people broke. The whisper in the flour sack, they say, though there's no proof, that a rumor once passed from village to village in southern France, that hidden inside the sacks of flour were royal letters, letters from the king, from ministers, from the queen, orders to starve the people. plans to create famine, a scheme to make the poor beg for mercy. No such letters were ever found, but people believed in them. They opened sacks with knives, sifted through with fingers, whispered warnings. To neighbors, it wasn't about paper, it was about trust. And it was gone. The disappearance of Floret began, as many things did, with disappearance. One morning, the flower stalls at Les Halles, the massive open-air market at the center of Paris, were simply empty vendors stood behind bare carts. Signs hung blank. Children cried. A woman named Claudette, who sold wild mushrooms and dried herbs, later told a local official, "It was like waking up to silence. No dust in the air, no sacks, just the echo of people asking for what no one had." The city had eaten everything, and more was not arriving. The roads were blocked. The rivers were slow. The taxes on grain transport, called octroi, had become so burdensome that merchants refused to make the trip. Flour, it turned out, could not be trusted to arrive. The bakers locked their doors by April of that year. A baker on Rue de Cinzy, La Verrerie, named Thomas Joubert, boarded his windows with iron. He left a single note on the door. "No bread, no flour, no violence, please." 2 days later, someone broke the window anyway. They didn't take money. They didn't take tools. They left a single loaf on the counter, stale, wrapped in parchment. Scrawled across it in charcoal were the words "For the King." Joubert never reopened his bakery. The bread march of the children in May 1789, a group of children, some as young as 7, marched through the Marais district holding empty baskets. They didn't chant, they didn't cry, they simply walked, holding their baskets high. They stopped at every bakery, at every stall, at every market gate. They said nothing. People followed, first mothers, then workers, then the elderly. It wasn't a protest, it wasn't even organized, but it was remembered. An English traveler, Henry Wortley, described it in his journal. "I saw what looked like a funeral procession of hunger. Not a word among them, only basket and silence. A royal breakfast around the same time in Versailles. The royal family sat down to breakfast. It was a light affair. Tea, eggs, candied fruits, a basket of brioche rolls placed in the center. The Queen, half listening to a courtier's complaint about provincial taxes, reportedly pushed the basket aside. "Too soft," she said. A servant noted the remark. That note, just 2 words, somehow found its way into a pamphlet 2 weeks later. But the wording had changed. Now it read, "Let them eat cake." There's no evidence Marie Antoinette ever said those words. But in a city where there was no bread at all, the phrase lit like fire, and it burned fast. When the first stone was thrown, June 3rd, 1789, a crowd gathered outside the bakery of Monsieur Desrosiers, known for selling to the gendarmerie. Rumor claimed he had hidden flour in the basement, that he had a deal with the military, that his family never went hungry. None of it was confirmed. By midday, stones were being thrown. By evening, the shop was ash and smoke. Desrosiers survived, barely. His wife did not. The city's police recorded the incident simply as disturbance. Bread dispute, 1 fatality, premises destroyed, nothing more. But the incident traveled from bakery to tavern, from corner to square. The message, the bakers' list-in secret. The bakers of Paris began to meet. They created a list, not of names, but of shops. Which ones had been attacked? Which ones still had flour? Which ones were next? They didn't share it with police. They shared it among themselves, passing it in wax-sealed letters, spoken in whispers. One baker, Maurice Leclerc, wrote, "We no longer bake to nourish, we bake to survive." His handwriting was rough. There was flour smudged into the paper. That list, now, called La Liste des Flammes, still exists. Charred at the edges, stored in the Paris archives. A map of fear. The woman who stood in the oven on June 17th, a baker in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, refused to sell his last loaves. The crowd surged, screamed, demanded. His wife, Madeleine, stepped forward. She opened the oven door and climbed inside. She said, "I'll burn with the bread before I see it stolen." No one moved. For a moment there was only heat and silence. Then someone offered money. More than the bread was worth. She refused. Then someone offered her a basket of apples. She nodded. The bread was exchanged and the crowd left quietly. That act, so small, became legend. Madeleine was later called the Woman of the Hearth, a symbol of dignity. In the halls of power, at the same time the Estates General was in chaos. Third Estate delegates, the Commons, had broken away. They demanded reform. They demanded food rights. They demanded the end of internal grain tolls. One delegate, a miller's son named Bernard, stood before the gathered nobility and held up a small loaf. "This weighs half what it did when I was a boy, but it costs double. And you dare call this progress?" He threw it to the floor. The nobles did not respond. But outside, the people heard and repeated the story until it grew. When the mills went still one by one, mills along the Seine closed their doors. The water wheels stopped turning. Some were sabotaged, others abandoned. Millstones cracked, sacks were burned, workers fled. One miller, Jean-Luc Lenoir, nailed a board to his door. "The grain is gone. The work is done. Let the wind carry your hunger." His body was later found in the river. A city of empty baskets by July. Paris was a city of empty baskets. A mother carried one for the look of it, to pretend she had something to carry home. A boy painted fake loaves from scraps of wood, just to hold something in his arms. And in one of the poorest quarters, a single note was nailed to a wall. "When bread becomes hope and hope becomes fire, only ashes remain." No one claimed authorship, but soon after the Bastille would fall, not for its guns, not for its prisoners, but because bread had become blood. The day the bakers disappeared on July 10th, 3 days before the fall of the Bastille, 23 bakers vanished from their shops across Paris, not abducted, not killed, simply gone. They left behind locked doors, empty shelves, and in some cases farewell notes. One read, "I cannot bake for those who would burn me." Another said, "The fire in the oven is safer than the fire in the street." A child was found asleep in one of the shops, curled up in a flour bin, waiting for her father to return. He never did. Later, the people would call this event La Veillée des Cendres, the Vigil of Ashes. The flour barricade on the morning of July 14th, while the city's attention turned toward the Bastille, another kind of rebellion was forming just blocks away. The narrow alleys near the Pont au Change, a group of women, washerwomen, laundresses, cooks, overturned a grain cart. They built a barricade, not with stones or wood, but with flour. They opened the sacks, let the white dust pour into the street. The air was thick with it. It coated faces, hair, eyelashes. Some said the street looked like snow, and then someone lit a match, just one. The flour burst into flame. It didn't last long, just enough to turn heads. Just enough to leave behind a burn mark on the cobblestones. It's still there, faint, faded, a scorch mark shaped like a loaf. The baker's son at the gates. That same day, as the Bastille was stormed, a boy no older than 12 stood at its gates. His name was Julien Marchand, son of a baker. Orphaned just weeks earlier, he carried no weapon, only a wooden paddle, the kind used to slide bread into an oven. A soldier mocked him, asked if he planned to bake the fortress. Julien said nothing, but after the gates fell and the crowds poured in, he was seen standing in the courtyard, holding the paddle high. It became a symbol, a paddle held like a banner. In later paintings, he was called the boy with the flame of hunger. No one knows what happened to him after that day. The bread of liberty in the months that followed the National. Assembly debated everything: monarchy, taxes, church property. But one issue never left the table: bread. In October, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was amended to include a clause, never formalized, that food was a natural right. The phrase used was, "Le pain est le peuple." Bread is the people, and across France, public bread ovens were built. Ovens not for profit. Not for prestige, but for need. They were called fours fraternels, fraternal ovens. Some still exist, overgrown, with soot-streaked chimneys and stone hearths. Their heat long gone, but their memory warm. The woman who fed the Mobbin, November of Arthur. 1789, a woman named Bernadette Brousseau, once a baker's wife, now a widow, reopened her shop. But she didn't sell bread. She gave it. Each morning she baked 5 dozen small loaves. She placed them on a table outside her shop. Above it hung a sign carved into old wood: "Take what you need." Eat it with care. She never asked for money, never asked for names. When asked why, she simply said, "Because I remember what it feels like to wait in line and find nothing left." Years later, when she passed, people placed bread crusts on her grave instead of flowers. A meal with no king by 1793. The monarchy was gone. The king beheaded. The queen too. But the hunger remained. The revolution had changed everything, except the fields, the floods, the failing grain routes. Bread was still short, flour still scarce, and so the people turned to one another: communal meals, shared gardens, bartered grain. One revolutionary leader, Pierre-François Denis, said in a speech, "Let us build a table longer than the throne ever was." It became a motto, a dream, a kingdom where food was no longer privilege, but presence. The recipe for resistance in a small village outside Toulouse. A recipe was written on parchment. It had no measurements, no yeast, no sugar. It simply read, "Bread made of what remains, eaten without shame, shared without price." It was copied, recopied, passed along, baked by grandmothers, painted on walls, etched into wood. It wasn't about ingredients. It was about memory, of hunger, of hope, of the long thin line between the two. The last loaf in 1795, as the dust of the revolution settled, a baker named Henri Laval made a final loaf in his family's shop. He baked it alone, wrapped it in linen, and placed it on the steps of the Paris town hall. He left no note, but someone who saw him remembered the look on his face. Peace. The loaf was never eaten, preserved in wax. Placed in a museum decades later, it sits behind glass now dry, cracked, a relic of a time when bread was louder than bullets. How's the air where you are? Still and cool, or gently stirred by the soft hum of night? Wherever you are, let your breath slow. Let the blanket settle. Let the thoughts fall away one by one like breadcrumbs down an empty hall. We are staying in France, but this time we step inside a kitchen, a royal one. Hot, crowded, and utterly unlike the throne rooms upstairs. Tonight we tell the story of a man you've never heard of, a cook not a general, not a writer, just a man with burn marks on his arms and recipes in his head. Cooking, for kings as the kingdom crumbled. Let's walk into the steam, into the noise, into the heavy silence beneath the chandeliers of Versailles. His name was Jacques Collignon. He was born in 1745 in a village with no name worth remembering. His father was a cooper. His mother cleaned floors at the local inn. At age 12, Jacques was apprenticed to a baker in Tours. At 17, he worked in a tavern kitchen near Orleans, where he learned to debone quail with his eyes closed. By 25, he had found his way to Paris, and by 30, he was stirring soup in the basement kitchens of Versailles, alongside men twice his size with half his patience. He wasn't the head chef. Not yet, but he knew the work. He knew how to fold butter into flour with 2 fingers and no waste. He knew how to carve a goose so cleanly it looked whole even after serving. He knew when to speak, and more importantly, when not to, and over time, his silence earned him trust. The kitchens of Versailles. The royal kitchens weren't one room. They were a city. 6 floors below the Hall of Mirrors, they sprawled across vaulted chambers, lined with soot-stained brick and clanging copper. Each section had a purpose: la boucherie, the butchery, where men worked elbow-deep in blood; la rôtisserie, the roasting room with its iron spits and smoke; la pâtisserie, the pastry corner, where sugar turned to lace and flour floated like breath; la soupe, where Jacques worked, steaming, bubbling vats; cauldrons of broth. The kitchens fed over 5,000 people each day. Nobles, guards, courtiers, servants. Meals were timed with the bakers' list-in secret. The bakers of Paris began to meet. They created a list, not of names, but of shops. Which ones had been attacked? Which ones still had flour? Which ones were next? They didn't share it with police. They shared it among themselves, passing it in wax-sealed letters, spoken in whispers. One baker, Maurice Leclerc, wrote, "We no longer bake to nourish, we bake to survive." His handwriting was rough. There was flour smudged into the paper. That list, now, called La Liste des Flammes, still exists, charred at the edges, stored in the Paris archives. A map of fear. The woman who stood in the oven on June 17th, a baker in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, refused to sell his last loaves. The crowd surged, screamed, demanded. His wife, Madeleine, stepped forward. She opened the oven door and climbed inside. She said, "I'll burn with the bread before I see it stolen." No one moved. For a moment there was only heat and silence. Then someone offered money, more than the bread was worth. She refused. Then someone offered her a basket of apples. She nodded. The bread was exchanged and the crowd left quietly. That act, so small, became legend. Madeleine was later called the Woman of the Hearth, a symbol of dignity. In the halls of power, at the same time the Estates General was in chaos. Third Estate delegates, the Commons, had broken away. They demanded reform. They demanded food rights. They demanded the end of internal grain tolls. One delegate, a miller's son named Bernard, stood before the gathered nobility and held up a small loaf. "This weighs half what it did when I was a boy, but it costs double. And you dare call this progress?" He threw it to the floor. The nobles did not respond. But outside, the people heard and repeated the story until it grew. When the mills went still one by one, mills along the Seine closed their doors. The water wheels stopped turning. Some were sabotaged, others abandoned. Millstones cracked, sacks were burned, workers fled. One miller, Jean-Luc Lenoir, nailed a board to his door. "The grain is gone. "The work is done. Let the wind carry your hunger." His body was later found in the river. A city of empty baskets by July. Paris was a city of empty baskets. A mother carried one for the look of it, to pretend she had something to carry home. A boy painted fake loaves from scraps of wood, just to hold something in his arms. And in one of the poorest quarters, a single note was nailed to a wall. "When bread becomes hope and hope becomes fire, only ashes remain." No one claimed authorship, but soon after the Bastille would fall, not for its guns, not for its prisoners, but because bread had become blood. The day the bakers disappeared on July 10th, 3 days before the fall of the Bastille, 23 bakers vanished from their shops across Paris, not abducted, not killed, simply gone. They left behind locked doors, empty shelves, and in some cases farewell notes. One read, "I cannot bake for those who would burn me." Another said, "The fire in the oven is safer than the fire in the street." A child was found asleep in one of the shops, curled up in a flour bin, waiting for her father to return. He never did. Later, the people would call this event La Veillée des Cendres, the Vigil of Ashes. The flour barricade on the morning of July 14th, while the city's attention turned toward the Bastille, another kind of rebellion was forming just blocks away. The narrow alleys near the Pont au Change, a group of women, washerwomen, laundresses, cooks, overturned a grain cart. They built a barricade, not with stones or wood, but with flour. They opened the sacks, let the white dust pour into the street. The air was thick with it. It coated faces, hair, eyelashes. Some said the street looked like snow, and then someone lit a match, just one. The flour burst into flame. It didn't last long, just enough to turn heads. Just enough to leave behind a burn mark on the cobblestones. It's still there, faint, faded, a scorch mark shaped like a loaf. The baker's son at the gates. That same day, as the Bastille was stormed, a boy no older than 12 stood at its gates. His name was Julien Marchand, son of a baker, orphaned just weeks earlier. He carried no weapon, only a wooden paddle, the kind used to slide bread into an oven. A soldier mocked him, asked if he planned to bake the fortress. Julien said nothing, but after the gates fell and the crowds poured in, he was seen standing in the courtyard, holding the paddle high. It became a symbol, a paddle held like a banner. In later paintings, he was called the boy with the flame of hunger. No one knows what happened to him after that day. The bread of liberty in the months that followed, the National. Assembly debated everything, monarchy, taxes, church property. But one issue never left the table, bread. In October, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was amended to include a clause, never formalized, that food was a natural right. The phrase used was, "Le pain est le peuple." Bread is the people, and across France, public bread ovens were built. Ovens not for profit. Not for prestige, but for need. They were called fours fraternels, fraternal ovens. Some still exist, overgrown, with soot-streaked chimneys and stone hearths. Their heat long gone, but their memory warm. The woman who fed the Mobbin, November of Arthur. 1789, a woman named Bernadette Brousseau, once a baker's wife, now a widow, reopened her shop. But she didn't sell bread. She gave it. Each morning she baked 5 dozen small loaves. She placed them on a table outside her shop. Above it hung a sign carved into old wood, "Take what you need." Eat it with care. She never asked for money, never asked for names. When asked why, she simply said, because I remember what it feels like to wait in line and find nothing left. Years later, when she passed, people placed bread crusts on her grave instead of flowers. A meal with no king by 1793. The monarchy was gone. The king beheaded. The queen too. But the hunger remained. The revolution had changed everything, except the fields, the floods, the failing grain routes. Bread was still short, flour still scarce, and so the people turned to one another, communal meals, shared gardens, bartered grain. One revolutionary leader, Pierre-François Denis, said in a speech, "Let us build a table longer than the throne ever was." It became a motto, a dream, a kingdom where food was no longer privilege, but presence. The recipe for resistance in a small village outside Toulouse. A recipe was written on parchment. It had no measurements, no yeast, no sugar. It simply read, "Bread made of what remains, eaten without shame, shared without price." It was copied, recopied, passed along, baked by grandmothers, painted on walls, etched into wood. It wasn't about ingredients. It was about memory, of hunger, of hope, of the long thin line between the two. The last loaf in 1795, as the dust of the revolution settled, a baker named Henri Laval made a final loaf in his family's shop. He baked it alone, wrapped it in linen, and placed it on the steps of the Paris town hall. He left no note, but someone who saw him remembered the look on his face. Peace. The loaf was never eaten, preserved in wax. Placed in a museum decades later, it sits behind glass now dry, cracked, a relic of a time when bread was louder than bullets. How's the air where you are? Still and cool, or gently stirred by the soft hum of night? Wherever you are, let your breath slow. Let the blanket settle. Let the thoughts fall away one by one like breadcrumbs down an empty hall. We are staying in France, but this time we step inside a kitchen, a royal one. Hot, crowded, and utterly unlike the throne rooms upstairs. Tonight we tell the story of a man you've never heard of. A cook, not a general, not a writer. Just a man with burn marks on his arms and recipes in his head. Cooking for kings as the kingdom crumbled. Let's walk into the steam, into the noise, into the heavy silence beneath the chandeliers of Versailles. His name was Jacques Collignon. He was born in 1745 in a village with no name worth remembering. His father was a cooper. His mother cleaned floors at the local inn. At age 12, Jacques was apprenticed to a baker in Tours. At 17, he worked in a tavern kitchen near Orleans, where he learned to debone quail with his eyes closed. By 25, he had found his way to Paris, and by 30, he was stirring soup in the basement kitchens of Versailles, alongside men twice his size with half his patience. He wasn't the head chef. Not yet, but he knew the work. He knew how to fold butter into flour with 2 fingers and no waste. He knew how to carve a goose so cleanly it looked whole even after serving. He knew when to speak, and more importantly, when not to, and over time, his silence earned him trust. The kitchens of Versailles. The royal kitchens weren't one room. They were a city. 6 floors below the Hall of Mirrors, they sprawled across vaulted chambers, lined with soot-stained brick and clanging copper. Each section had a purpose. La boucherie, the butchery, where men worked elbow-deep in blood. La rôtisserie, the roasting room with its iron spits and smoke. La pâtisserie, the pastry corner, where sugar turned to lace and flour floated like breath. La soupe, where Jacques worked, steaming, bubbling vats. Cauldrons of broth. The kitchens fed over 5,000 people each day, nobles, guards, courtiers, servants, Meals were timed with the precision of war. Mistakes were punishable. Stealing an egg could mean prison. And through it all, Jacques stirred and ladled and chopped, unnoticed. That was his gift. A feast for shadows in early 1789, as revolution trembled at the edges of France, the king ordered a private feast, not a public spectacle, not a diplomatic gala, just 30 guests, trusted, loyal. The meal would take place in the smaller of the palace's dining rooms, Salon de Diane, beneath a crystal chandelier and silk wallpaper. The chef in charge, Monsieur Delvigne, assigned Jacques the main course, a roast venison, glazed in honey and vinegar, surrounded by wild mushrooms and herbed chestnuts. Jacques said nothing. He nodded. Began work that same night. The kitchen was humid. The venison took hours. He trimmed it by candlelight, sharpened his knives in silence, basted in careful rhythm. He did not know this would be the last great feast served to the Bourbon monarchy. He only knew that the vinegar was too sharp, and he added a spoonful of fig jam d'Auris. The fork with a missing tine on the morning of the feast, Jacques stood by the serving corridor. He had polished his ladle. His apron was new, starched white, stitched with his initials in one corner, J.C. A steward handed him the plate, and he walked it up the narrow stone stairs, 2 at a time, the way he had done for 15 years. He placed the dish before the king and bowed. Then he noticed the fork. It sat beside the plate, silver, slender, and one of its tines was bent. Not broken, just bent, barely visible. He didn't say anything, but that night in his journal he wrote, "A fork unbent, a kingdom still." He didn't know why he wrote it, but 3 months later, when the mobs came, he would remember that tine. The kitchen goes quiet. After the feast, something shifted. Fewer orders came down. The wine shipments slowed. The cream deliveries stopped altogether, and the laughter upstairs became less frequent. Jacques was reassigned to cold dishes, aspics and jellies easier to store, quicker to serve. The soup pots were left untouched. At night, the kitchen felt like a cathedral after Mass, hollow, warm, haunted. He cleaned his ladle with vinegar, hung it on the same hook, and waited. The smell of smoke on July 14th. News came by word of mouth. The Bastille had fallen. In the kitchens, no bells rang, no toasts were made, but a boy, a kitchen runner named Luc, ran into the storeroom and whispered, "They say they're coming for the silver first." Jacques didn't respond. He was buttering a copper mold for a fish terrine. The mold slipped in his hand and fell to the floor. It rang like a bell, and everyone stopped. The night the ladle was hidden later that week, as whispers turned to shouts, and the palace gates braced for what would come. Jacques walked to his station after hours. He opened the small drawer beside the stove. Inside was his ladle, the same one he'd used for 18 years. He wrapped it in linen, tied it with twine, and tucked it behind a loose stone in the kitchen wall. He didn't know if he would ever return, but something about that ladle, dented, worn, shaped by years of broth and care, felt worth saving. A feast. No one ate it. Was August of 1789. Just a few weeks after the Bastille had fallen, the Queen had ordered a small gathering, 12 guests, mostly family, mostly nervous. Jacques was called up once more. But this time something felt wrong. The orders were confused, 3 dishes cancelled, another added late. The wine was bitter and unpaired. The cheese never arrived. He prepared a duck confit with orange glaze, a dish he had made dozens of times. before. But when he brought it to the dining room, only half the seats were filled. The Queen did not smile. The King did not speak. And when Jacques returned an hour later to collect the plates, every one of them was untouched. The candles had burned low. The room smelled like wax and wilted roses, and something else, fear, the pantry. That echoed. Jacques began to notice things. The larder was thinner. The barrels of salt pork weren't being restocked. The cheese racks were dusty. The spice shelf had been locked. He walked past the dry goods chamber and paused. It was quiet, too quiet. Normally there would be humming, or the scrape of scoops, or the knock of knuckles tapping grain. But now, only stillness. He stepped inside. Half. The shelves were bare, and a single spoon lay on the floor, dented like it had been stepped on, or dropped in haste. He picked it up, turned it in his hand, and placed it in his pocket. A letter that was never sent. Jacques had a brother, Henri, a grocer in Nantes. They hadn't spoken in years, a falling out over something neither of them truly remembered. But in late August, Jacques sat at a narrow table in the staff dormitory and began to write. Henri, the kitchens are dying. Not all at once, but piece by piece. The broth turns before it boils. The knives stay sharp, but they don't cut anything anymore. I think the Queen is afraid. The King stares at his plate like it's a document. I don't know what's coming, but I've hidden my ladle. If you ever hear my name in the street, know that I stayed until the last course. He folded the letter, but he never posted it. It was found years later, tucked inside a cookbook in the palace library. The day the fire went out, one morning in September, Jacques arrived to find the stove cold, not low. Cold, no coals, no embers. Just ash. He checked the stores. There was no wood, no kindling, no oil for the lamps. He stood there, holding his pot with both hands, as the quiet settled around him like smoke. Then he placed the pot down and sat. The mirror hall feels hunger above. The kitchens, the hall of mirrors, remained as brilliant as ever, at least to the eye, but now diplomats cancelled their visits. Feasts were postponed. The harpists stopped playing during dinner, and the Queen's gowns, once heavy with pearls and ribbon, were seen less often. One servant said she had begun skipping meals. Another claimed she wept over a crust of bread. Jacques heard none of this firsthand, but in the kitchens he noticed that the trays were lighter, the soup bowls fewer, the desserts simpler, and one day the salt cellar, a silver one shaped like a swan, was quietly taken and never returned. The cook and the blacksmith Versailles had a smithy, a small forge near the stables where hinges were fixed and knives sharpened. Jacques visited it one evening long after sunset. He brought his cleaver, not for sharpening, but to melt. The blacksmith looked at him, puzzled. Jacques simply said, "It's too heavy now." The blacksmith nodded. He melted the cleaver, poured the metal into a mold the size of a coin. Jacques carried it in his pocket. After that, his new currency, one piece of quiet steel, a reminder of what used to matter. The last soup on October 4th, Jacques made soup. Not because he was asked, because the carrots were about to spoil. He diced them by instinct, threw in what he had, and barley, garlic, onion, old broth. He stirred it slowly, eyes half closed as if in prayer. No one came to eat it. He left it in a pot on the counter and walked away. The mob arrives. It was October 5th, 1789. Thousands marched from Paris to Versailles, mostly women, tired of hunger, furious at delay. They carried sticks, pitchforks, old rifles, and cooking knives. They marched in rain, in mud, with baskets on their hips and curses on their tongues, their demand bread. At the palace, confusion reigned. The guards stood uncertain. The king retreated. The queen hid. But in the kitchen, buried deep beneath all of it, Jacques waited. He heard the muffled thunder above, the scrape of boots, the shouts, and he kept peeling onions one after another, clean, even, calm, smoke in the hall. The mob didn't reach the kitchens, they had no reason to, but smoke did. The fires upstairs, torches, overturned lamps, looted chambers, sent soot down into the air shafts. The kitchen filled slowly with a dusty haze. Jacques took a damp cloth and tied it around his mouth. He covered the soup pot, though there was no soup inside, and then very quietly he sat at the long wooden table where servants once ate in shifts. He folded his hands and listened. The door that never closed. Later that night, when the palace was overrun and the royal family marched away under escort, the staff was dismissed, not formally. There were no announcements, just a sudden quiet and an open door. Jacques stepped outside. He walked through the gardens, where hedges were torn and fountains stilled. He passed the statue of Apollo, cracked, splashed with mud. He passed the guard, post where no one watched, and he did not look back. But when he reached the outer gate, he stopped. He turned once and muttered, "I left the oven open." The field beyond Versailles Jacques didn't go far. He found work in a tavern an hour's walk from the palace. No title, no uniform, just chopping onions and scraping pans. He never spoke of Versailles, but when customers cursed the new republic or praised the old king, Jacques said only, "I cooked for all of them." They all ate, and none of them thanked the soup. He didn't say it with bitterness, just in fact. He kept his ladle still wrapped in linen. He hung it above the stove in the tavern. No one asked why. The girl who asked. One spring, a child, the innkeeper's daughter, asked Jacques what the queen liked to eat. He paused, then said, "Almonds. She always ate the sugared almonds first." The girl laughed, and Jacques smiled, but she never finished her plate. The girl asked why. Jacques answered because she never had to. He gave her a cookie shaped like a crown and went back to his work. The forgotten recipe in his final years, Jacques wrote a small book, not a memoir, not a recipe book in the usual sense, just lists, notes. Add vinegar later, or it bites. Carrot, skins only if scrubbed, salt after the flame dies down. When the king eats alone, he chews slower. When the queen cries, the soup curdles. He never published it. He left it beneath the floorboard of his room. It was found in 1923 by a plumber. Now, it sits in the final ladle. When Jacques died, no family came, but the tavern owner placed his ladle in his hands. They buried him in the garden behind the inn. A rosebush now grows there. Every spring, someone hangs a fork from its branches. No one knows who. But the wind clinks against the metal like a bell, a small reminder that someone once fed a king and stayed until the table was empty. The morning routine in Versailles. Everything ran on routine. The fires were lit at the same time. The water hauled in buckets. The bread delivered before dawn. And the fish, always the fish, arrived by cart from Paris before the second bell. There was a man for this. Of course there was. His name was Léon Bresson, the royal fish steward. He was not noble, not well spoken, but he knew fish. He could tell the age of a trout by the stiffness of its tail. He knew the scent of spoiled eel. He could pick out the precise weight of a sturgeon without lifting it. He took his job seriously, because fish at Versailles wasn't just food. It was performance, a glistening centerpiece, a reflection of power, a symbol that all was still functioning in the machine of monarchy. And that morning, the morning it all began, Léon was waiting at the back gate. But the cart did not come. The missed cart is icy. Delay was unusual. The fish came from Les Halles in Paris, packed in crates of crushed ice and straw, carried overnight on iron-wheeled carts. It was a 3-hour trip, but that morning the road was blocked. A farmer had overturned a hay wagon near the Pont de Sèvres. No one was injured, but traffic halted for hours. The fish cart, stuck behind a grain delivery, sat in the sun. The ice melted. By the time it reached Versailles, the trout were soft. The eels were swollen. The pike had begun to turn grey. Léon inspected them in silence, then shook his head. A choice in the kitchens, panic spread like smoke. The second course, a baked turbot with herbs and lemon cream, was the highlight of the king's noonday meal. Without it, the menu fell apart. The head chef considered substitutions: a veal pâté, too heavy; a mushroom tart, too plain. A servant suggested skipping the course entirely. The room went quiet. That had never happened before. Skipping a course, even one, was a breach of ceremony, a gap in the rhythm of power. But there was no time. The clock was ticking. The guests were seated, and the platters were empty. The meal goes on. The first course was served, asparagus with hollandaise, soft and delicate. But then, instead of fish, the third course arrived early. Roast capon with chestnut dressing. The E.G. guests noticed. They said nothing, but Fawkes hesitated, brows furrowed. At the far end of the table, the Queen whispered something to a lady in waiting. A steward passed by and made a mark in his ledger. Course 2, absent. No explanation. The king ate in silence. When the meal ended, no one clapped. No one lingered. The table was cleared quickly, and the uneaten capon was returned to the kitchen, still warm. The whispers begin. By evening, the absence of fish had become a question. Why was it missing? Was it protest? Was it sabotage? Was the fish poisoned? In the salons and side chambers, courtiers speculated. One claimed he'd seen a rat in the delivery wagon. Another said the Queen had banned seafood due to a dream. None of it was true, but it didn't matter, because at Versailles, absence was never just absence. It was a message, and no one could agree on what it meant. In the streets of Paris, while the court murmured about fish, the streets of Paris were boiling over with hunger. In Les Halles, the fishmongers argued over missing carts and melting ice. A delivery boy was beaten for arriving late. A merchant claimed the king had ordered all the best catch for himself. Pamphlets followed the next day. While Paris eats salt cod, the king chokes on spoiled river trout. It was a lie, but it sold well, and in taverns and markets people repeated it like gospel. They weren't angry about fish, they were angry about what the fish represented. The man who took the blame, Léon Bresson, the royal fish steward, was summoned the next morning. He stood in the corridor outside the steward's chamber, hat in hand. He explained the blockage, the heat, the delay. He offered receipts, timetables, a letter from the cart driver. None of it mattered. He was dismissed. No trial, no punishment. Just removed. His name erased from the delivery log. His room reassigned. That evening he packed his things and left through the servants' gate. He would never return to Versailles. The kitchen tries to forget after Léon Bresson's dismissal. No one in the kitchen spoke his name, but his absence was felt. The new steward was quiet, uncertain. His hands shook when inspecting crates. He didn't smell the fish. He didn't press the flesh. He simply nodded and passed things along. One day, a shipment of river carp was accepted even though the gills were grey. Jacques, yes, the same cook from the previous tale, still working, quietly in the background, muttered to no one in particular. When the fish don't speak, the rot begins in the mouth. Someone laughed, but no one disagreed. A quiet retaliation. Several kitchen workers, loyal to Léon, began to notice things. The delivery schedule was off. The fish crates arrived late or not at all. Sometimes the fish was fine. Sometimes it was weeks old. So one of them, a porter named Clément, took matters into his own hands. He began rerouting a portion of the good fish, smuggling it to a nearby convent where orphans were housed. He left no note, took no credit. But once a week at dawn, a small cart appeared at the convent gate with trout, anchovies, or oysters. The nuns called it the mercy catch. No one ever caught him, because no one ever looked. Upstairs, the Queen notices in her private chambers, Marie Antoinette began to change her habits. She avoided fish. She claimed it gave her headaches. But her ladies-in-waiting knew the real reason: rumor. The court was thick with stories. That the Queen had ordered Léon dismissed for failing her appetite. That she refused to eat food that had touched the streets of Paris. That she was importing eels from Vienna instead. None of it was true, but the whispers grew. And so the Queen requested simpler meals: bread, cheese, preserves. The cooks adjusted, carefully removing fish from the menus without acknowledgement. No one dared say it aloud, but the second course, the fish course, was unofficially gone. The fishmonger, who protested back in Paris, a woman named Yvette Durand, who sold fish from a stall in Les Halles, became something of a local legend. She was known for speaking her mind, and when taxes were raised on market vendors, she built a sculpture out of spoiled mackerel in the shape of the royal crest. She called it the Crown of Rot. She was arrested, fined, released, but her act made the rounds, in conversation, in pamphlets, in cartoons, and soon other vendors followed suit. A parade of shriveled fish, scales painted gold, fish heads with crowns. It wasn't about the fish. It was about the bite. A paper fish. That same month, an anonymous pamphlet appeared in Paris. It was titled The Phantom Feast of Versailles. Inside it described, in vivid, sarcastic detail, an imaginary meal where every course was empty. Soup bowls filled with shadows, platters of nothing, a roasted void garnished with silence, a whole trout made entirely of paper. The author described the king raising his fork to stab the imaginary fish and saying, "Ah, finally, something as real as my power." Of course, none of it happened, but people laughed, and the paper fish became a symbol, folded from pamphlets, taped to bakery doors, hung from carts. Some said it was childish, others called it the most honest meal Versailles ever served. The broken fountain. On the palace grounds, a marble fountain shaped like a fish once spouted water into a reflecting pool. One morning, a palace gardener found it cracked down the middle. No one knew how. Some said lightning, others blamed frost. A workman removed the statue, but someone, perhaps a servant, left a single sardine on the empty pedestal. It stayed there for hours before the birds found it. Just enough time for people to notice. Just enough time for rumors to grow. The king asks a question. according to a record kept by a footman, Louis XVI, during a modest breakfast of boiled eggs and soft cheese, paused, looked at his steward, and asked, "Did we used to serve fish at supper?" The steward replied, "Yes, Your Majesty." The king nodded. "It's been gone for some time, hasn't it?" "Yes, Your Majesty." The king did not ask why, and the subject was not raised again. A city that eats nothing by winter, hunger in Paris reached new levels. Flour prices rose. Bread lines grew. Fish was a luxury. Even salted cod became rare. In one neighborhood, a communal stew pot, fed by scraps and bones, was renamed La Soupe du Roi. It contained no fish, just water, cabbage, and salt. People laughed as they ate it, because somehow the joke made the hunger easier. A banquet without water in. The early months of 1790, a banquet was held at Versailles. It was not meant for nobility, it was for the National Guard, a gesture, a form of reassurance. Jacques, still in the kitchens, was called back to prepare broth and bread. No silver trays, no turbot, no trout, just cabbage soup and rolls, a new menu for a new age. But when the guests arrived, they noticed something strange. No water had been placed on the tables, not a single piece. The convent closes its gate. In a convent on the edge of Paris, and the same one that once received Clément's secret fish cart, the nuns gathered for supper. But there was nothing to eat. The fishmonger had been arrested. The cart had stopped. Coming. The garden was frozen. The eldest nun, Sister Marie Bernard, stood, raised her hands and said, "Tonight we give thanks for all that is missing." They bowed their heads, and then sang a hymn to silence. Later, that moment was written in the margins of a prayer book, now kept in a Paris museum. It's labeled only "The Meal of Absence." The last inspection. By the end of 1790, the kitchens of Versailles were inspected for repurposing. A government official, name lost to time, toured the rooms with a clipboard. He noted the rust on the ovens, the cracks in the tiles, the smell of cold grease and forgotten spices. When he reached the fish station, he paused. A large iron sink, a row of empty hooks, and a silver platter still resting on the counter covered in dust. He tapped it with his pen. The sound echoed. Then he wrote simply, "No longer in use." A new table in Paris, a new kind of dinner was becoming common. Long. Wooden tables in public squares, shared food, shared stories. At one such table, a man named Alain, once a fishmonger's apprentice, carved sardines into small fillets with a butter knife. A girl beside him asked, "Did you ever sell to the Queen?" He shook his head, but after a pause he said, "I once touched a fish that was meant for her." He didn't smile. He didn't speak again that night, but he handed the girl the larger portion. A letter from the Riverain Odd Record appears in the Archives of the Seine River Patrol, dated March 1791. A small bundle had been pulled from the water, cloth-wrapped, tied in string. Inside, one fishbone. A note, ink-smeared. The note read, "The fish are gone. The king has eaten his last. No name, no date." It's unclear if it was a protest, a joke, a message, but the officer who recorded it ended his entry with a rare comment. Odd, cold, frighteningly quiet. The bundle was never claimed. Jacques closes the book by the time the monarchy fell. Jacques had long since left Versailles, but he kept a notebook, not of recipes, of absences, pages labeled with courses that were never served. Poached salmon, July 1789, fish soured in heat, baked sole, August 1789, steward dismissed. Grilled perch, September, cancelled, no explanation. Turbot, October, Queen declined to attend. All fish, November, menu revised. He closed the book on the final page and placed it in the back of a drawer with the ladle. Years later, both would be found and displayed in a glass case. Beneath the label, the key, kitchen that lost its place, a recipe left blanking, the ruins of a noble's home during the Terror. A servant cleaning out debris found a half-burned recipe journal. Most of the pages were singed, scorched beyond recognition, but one remained intact. It had a title, Turbot, à la reine, but beneath it, no ingredients, no instructions, just a blank page, as if the recipe had never existed, or was too dangerous to write down. The servant, not knowing what it meant, used the page to wrap a piece of dry cheese. The river swallows the rest, and so the fish disappeared. From menus, from carts, from rumors, from reason. The rivers kept flowing, but no one sent trout to the palace anymore. The eel traps were emptied and abandoned, and the people, long past hunger, long past anger, learned to live with simpler things. Bread, broth, bean stew. But in some places, when a meal was served late or a course forgotten, someone would say the fish didn't arrive, and everyone would nod because they understood. This story doesn't start in a palace, it starts in a street, a narrow one where the gutters are always wet, and the air smells like bread, blood, and coal smoke, where boots stick in mud, where voices echo through wooden shutters and iron grates. The year is 1789. The king still sits on his throne, though the legs beneath it are beginning to crack. And on a corner in Paris, no name needed because all streets were alike in hunger, there is a bakery, and across from it a butcher shop, two ordinary trades, two men with grease on their hands and thoughts they don't say aloud, and soon one more man who does not bake or carve or sell, but takes. Let's walk with them slowly and see how lives turn. One loaf, one chop, one choice at a time. The Théo, baker, his name was René Dupin. 53 years old, widow, no children. He owned a bakery no wider than a wagon. Stone floor, one window, and a blackened oven that had been patched more times than he could count. René had once baked for nobles. In his 20s, he had apprenticed in the kitchens of a wealthy household, shaping sugar into flours and painting yolk over golden crusts. Now he made black bread, coarse, thick, and hard at the edges, because that's what people could afford. He rose before the sun, measured flour by hand, and never locked his door because he knew the ones who stole didn't mean to. He wore an apron with a burn mark the shape of a spoon, and each morning he would light the oven, stare into the fire and mutter, "It's not the bread I fear burning, it's the people." The butcher, his name was Marc Deslauriers, younger than René, but not by much. He kept his hair tied back in a red cloth and smelled permanently of smoked meat. His shop was louder than the bakery, the thud of cleavers, the squeal of wheels turning, the spit, sawdust on the floor to catch the blood. Mark sold tripe to the poor, sausage to the working men, calf's liver to the wives of merchants who liked to pretend they were rich. He never married. He had a sister somewhere in the provinces, but letters stopped arriving years ago. He drank his coffee black, never charged orphans, and carried a curved blade in his belt, not for defense, but because he had nowhere else to put it. Mark respected René. They nodded to each other each morning, like two monks in different orders. Bread, meat, ritual, the E, Taker, his name, or at least the one he gave, was Ravel. He arrived one evening in a coat with a missing sleeve and boots that didn't match. He claimed to be a student, then a printer, then a courier, but no one believed any of it. Ravel didn't work. He watched. He sat outside the bakery for hours, just watching loaves disappear from the shelves. He stood near the butcher's stall and took notes. Who bought what, how much, how often. He didn't carry a knife, just a notebook and a hunger. In his eyes, that wasn't about food, a city that hears footsteps. Paris had always been full of noise, but now it was nervous noise. Footsteps that ran faster than before, voices that dropped lower. Everyone knew something was coming. Butchers kept their blades close. Bakers double-checked their locks. The markets thinned. The soup grew thin too. René began waking to knocks that came before dawn. Mark found that people no longer met his eyes, and Ravel, always quiet, always still, seemed to be in more places than one man could be. At the river, in the square, outside, the church, always watching. The bread line on. A Tuesday in June, the line outside René's bakery stretched longer than ever. People waited silently. No pushing, just stares. René opened his shop late, not by design. He had run out of flour. When he opened the door, there were only 14 loaves. He sold 13 and kept one. Not for himself, but for the woman who came last each morning, a widow, with a blind son who never spoke above a whisper. When she arrived, empty basket in hand, he gave her the loaf, and someone in the line shouted, "Favoritism!" Another, "That was mine." Ravel stood near the back. He did not shout. He only wrote something in his book and walked away. The slab of beef 2 days later, Mark the butcher received a visit, not from a customer, from a guard, a patrolman, poorly shaved, smelling of wet leather. He asked Mark for meat. For the People's Patrol, he said. Mark offered sausage. The man asked for roast. Mark refused. The next day, someone threw a stone through his window. He found a note tied to it. The blade feeds all, or feeds no one. Ravel was seen that morning leaning against a lamppost, watching the glass be swept away. The visit. That evening Ravel came to the bakery. René was wiping the counter with an old cloth. Ravel didn't ask for bread. He asked for information. "How many loaves today?" 13, René replied, voice cautious. "How much did they pay?" "Enough," Ravel smiled. How much would they pay if they knew who got one for free? René didn't answer, but he did not sleep that night, and the next morning he nailed a board over the shop window, just in case. The ledger, it started with lists. Ravel, the taker, was seen writing again, not pamphlets, not speeches. Just names, a list of shops, a list of buyers, a list of prices. He never showed it to anyone, but everyone knew it existed. They called it le carnet de la faim, the hunger ledger. Mark saw his name written in it, just once, on a morning when he sliced beef too thin. René saw Ravel standing in the bakery doorframe, writing with his back turned. No one was arrested. No one was accused. But people started whispering, "If your name is in the ledger, your days are numbered." The bread. That went missing. One morning, René baked 16 loaves. He placed them on the shelf, counted them, marked them. By noon, only 13 remained. No money had changed hands. No door had opened. No customer had passed the counter. René asked his apprentice, a boy named Leo, what happened. Leo said nothing. He only looked down. That night, A paper. The man with a knife mark saw Ravel again on a Thursday. The butcher was wiping his knives, polishing the handle of his cleaver with wax and a scrap of leather. Ravel stood across the street, arms folded, watching. Mark lifted the cleaver slightly. Not a threat, just a gesture. Ravel smiled and nodded. Mark felt cold, not from fear, from understanding that the time of knives was coming, and not just for meat. The Committee of Bread. A few days later, a local committee was formed, Le Comité du Pain Juste, the Committee of Just Bread. It was made up of neighborhood men, not officials, not elected, just people. Tired, hungry, watching. Ravel was not on the committee, but he sat at their meetings, never speaking, only listening. And when the committee asked bakers to post their prices, René was the first to comply. He chalked the numbers on a slate board. Beneath it he wrote, "May this feed more than mouths." Some nodded, others spat, but no one questioned it aloud. The wrong cut one evening, Mark sold veal to a man he didn't recognize, well-dressed, gloves, thin voice. The next day, someone scratched a symbol into the butcher's door, a triangle, with a cleaver through it. Mark erased it. But that morning, no one came to buy. He sat behind his counter, cleaned tools that didn't need cleaning, and stared out the window, wondering when the city had started looking at his knives differently, not as tools, but as weapons. The letter René received a letter, folded into the morning bread sack. It read, "Baker, you give bread to some, not others. You think kindness is not watched, but the city watches, the people know. When the crust is shared unfairly, the whole loaf rots. No signature, no return address." René placed the letter in the oven, not to burn it, to hide it. He baked bread over it all day, and then never used that oven again. The turning it happened on a grey Sunday. The market was quiet, the church bells late. Mark was walking to fetch water. René stood outside, sweeping ash from his doorway. Ravel walked by. He said nothing, but René spoke first. "Are we judged for what we sell, or for what we give away?" Ravel stopped, turned, and answered, "You're judged for what you save, and who you save it from." Then he walked on. "You've come far, still here, still listening, even as your thoughts drift, soft and slow, like steam rising from an empty pot. This is the end of a small story, of a baker, a butcher, and a man who never raised his voice. History often forgets men like these, but they shaped the world beneath the banners and speeches, quietly, steadily, sometimes unwillingly. And now we come to the final morning, when everything in the street changed, not with an explosion, not with fire, but with a knock at the door. The cartet arrived just after sunrise, a plain wooden cart. 2 wheels, no markings, pulled not by a horse but by 2 young men in rough coats. They stopped in front of René's bakery first, didn't speak, just knocked once. René opened the door with flour still on his hands. The taller of the 2 men handed him a slip of paper, a requisition. The bakery's loaves were to be taken immediately for the People's Assembly. No payment. No delay. René nodded and began packing bread into the cart. No protest, no words, only the sound of crusts bumping into each other and the quiet breathing of men trying not to look one another in the eyes. Across the street, the cart rolled across, to Mark's shop next. This time they didn't knock. They walked inside. Mark stood behind the counter, wiping his hands on a towel. They handed him the paper. He read it once, then folded it and said, You want the meat, you take it. But you take the knives too, or I keep those. The boys hesitated, then stepped back. Mark loaded salted pork and dried sausage into a burlap sack, left the knives hanging. No one smiled. No one thanked. The cart rolled on. Ravel returns. That evening, as the street quieted, Ravel walked by again. He paused in front of the bakery. Renee was closing the shutters. He looked tired, his shoulders sunken. Ravel said, "They said you gave them the best loaves." Renee replied, "Everyone deserves the best once." Across the street, Mark leaned against his doorway, arms crossed. Ravel turned to him. "And you?" "You gave them salted pork," Mark grunted. "Fresh was for the hungry, salted's for the fighters." Ravel nodded. No one spoke after that. The three men stood in silence as if waiting for something that had already happened. The last loaf weeks passed. The bakery closed. The ovens cooled. Renee no longer baked. He sat by the window with empty baskets and a quiet fire. But one morning he lit the oven again, just once. He baked a single loaf, shaped it carefully, brushed it with milk, wrapped it in cloth and carried it down the street. Not to a customer, to the garden behind the old church. He placed the loaf on a flat stone and left. Later, a child found it. She ate the crust, saved the rest, and said, "To know, one in particular, it tastes like quiet." The knife that was buried, Mark sharpened his knives one last time, not because he needed to, but because it was a habit he couldn't shake. Then he took the smallest one, a boning blade with a curved handle, and walked into the alley behind the shop. He dug a small hole beneath the rain barrel, wrapped the knife in wax cloth. Buried it with both hands and whispered, "Better to lose the edge than see it used wrong." The rain started soon after. It washed the earth smooth, and the blade never surfaced again. The ledger closes. Ravel kept his notebook until the very end. He filled. The last page with 3 lines. Dupin gave until he couldn't. Des Lauriers kept the sharpness to himself. Me took nothing. Still fed the flame. Then he tore the page out, folded it, and placed it under a loose stone in the bakery wall. A different kind of bread now filled Paris, rationed, dry, state-issued. But Ravel stopped writing. He disappeared soon after. Some say he joined the assembly, others the prisons, but no one ever confirmed it. The man who watched was gone. What was left behind? In later years, long after the revolution settled into something else, the street was renamed. The bakery became a school. The butcher shop, a boarding house. But sometimes on early mornings, when the fog settled low, people swore they could still smell bread, still hear a cleaver striking wood, still see the shape of a man in a long coat, watching without judgment. And in the dirt behind the old rain barrel. Grass never grew quite right. This is the time for slow stories, not the ones written in history book, but the ones remembered in corners, in empty bottles, in the dust at the bottom of a cellar. This is the story of a wine cask, or rather, the story of what happened when it didn't arrive. When the drink that once comforted a city brought discomfort instead. When a barrel turned bitter, and the people who drank it stopped believing in sweetness. The inn on Rue de Charenton, there was a tavern tucked into the corner of Rue de Charenton. Its name, Le Cœur Fendu, the split heart. No sign above the door, just a rusted horseshoe nailed sideways and a red curtain in the window. The owner was a woman named Nadege. No last name, just Nadege. She was known for 2 things: serving wine that didn't taste watered, throwing out anyone who whistled. She kept her hair tied up in an